Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, rigid ideologue of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today is writer Blake Smith. Really more than a guest, actually, because Blake has graciously agreed to sign on as a regular, every month or so conversation partner / co-host with me. He'll be the John McWhorter to my Glenn Loury, as it were. Sometimes we might function as co-hosts with another guest in the mix whom we're both asking questions of, but sometimes, and this episode is an example, we'll just be talking to each other. And so I think it'll be kind of individual conversations on specific topics, but then just an ongoing conversation over months and maybe years. We'll see. So thanks to Blake for doing this. The goal of this, not the first episode we've done together, but the first of our sort of new instantiation of our conversations. The goal going in was mostly to talk about the long essays that each of us happen to have written. Recently, Blake's on the New York intellectual and art critic Harold Rosenberg, the mid-century writer, and mine on the recent back and forth between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates on the topic of Charlie Kirk and how to think about him and how to deal with the Trump administration and the apparent inefficacy of the Democratic Party and what should be done about it. We did get to both of those topics, but only somewhat unexpectedly in the second half of the show, which will be available only to paid subscribers on this episode. The first equally effervescent half of the episode ended up focusing on Blake's feelings about the recent death of his father, Billy Smith. Or rather, I should say, where Blake's evasion of my efforts to get him to talk about his feelings led us, which was into issues of therapy and the therapeutic paradigm, whether it's realistic or even desirable to be endlessly introspective and vulnerable to the world, how I happen to be using ChatGPT to give me marital advice, whether all cultures across space and time have had a similar sense of the ways in which personal flourishing involves an evolution over time, and much more that's difficult to summarize, but I think really enjoyable to listen to. So what was pretty gratifying to me as I re-listened to the episode as a whole was noticing that there ended up being a real organic unity between that initial discussion prompted by the death of Blake's dad, and then the talk about our respective essays, which at least nominally were not about similar topics, but it's not an accident. Like many of you, we're thinking a great deal right now about how to live well in a world and do art well in a world that feels more uncertain and threatening than what we're accustomed to, and how to do that specifically within political and artistic communities whose expectation of the members of the community has intensified in a lot of ways. Expectations about what political line you might spout or what artistic approach you might take. So just to give you an example, here's Blake on Rosenberg. He writes towards the end of his essay, "What's most significant about Rosenberg's criticism is that as he shifted attention from one artist to another, he consistently sought to evaluate what a given artist's work revealed about how an individual in our society can use the cultural and institutional resources available to pry themselves out of their old personae and craft a new, more expansive and enfranchising identity. Throughout decades of writing about art, he always held that artists were to be judged for their success or failure at acting. That is, in finding ways to resist routine, cliché, and conformity on the one hand, and self-deluded escapism and fantasy on the other. These twin evils, he never stopped arguing, arise from the very nature of our capitalist society." And then here I am towards the end of my piece on Coates and Klein. "Why are we losing?" Klein says to Coates. "We're losing," says Coates, "because there are always moments when we lose." Now, this is me speaking. The problem with this answer isn't that it's wrong necessarily, but that it's immature. Coates may be utterly justified in his historical pessimism. He may be right. I don't think he is, but he may be. That nothing would have played out any better over the past decade had the left and the Democrats been more strategic in the ways that Klein is now saying they should have been. And yet still here we are. It's America 2025, a profoundly imperfect and inequitable society that is also open, pluralistic, and permeable to democratic action. We're far worse off than we could be and far better off than we've been at most points in the past. The question to all of us remains the same as it ever was. How should we act in the face of radical uncertainty and painfully conflicting priorities? This isn't fundamentally a political question of the kind that Coates wants to refuse, but an ethical one. It will lead to a different set of answers for a politician like Gavin Newsom, writers like Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and activists like Charlie Kirk, and then different yet again for all the people, i.e. most of the people, who are none of the above. But for any of us to answer it well is, I think, inevitably to venture into territory where clear answers aren't always easy to hand. Coates isn't wrong to tread carefully where the boundaries between writer and politician lie, nor are others wrong to suggest that Klein sometimes falls into confusion about which role is properly his. But it's Klein, it seems to me, who's out there trying to find his way with some vulnerability and courage to genuinely new and constructive syntheses, and Coates, who is pulled off at a rest stop idling somewhere short of the destination. So, I mean, I think, as is often the case, I mean, I'm writing about somebody else, but I'm also trying to lay out some sort of vision of what it is that I think I'm doing and what I happen to think Blake and I are doing here. It's a rich conversation. Hope you enjoy. Peace. Blake, welcome back for, I don't know, the 18,000th time to Eminent Americans.
It's fresh every time.
You're here in a sort of new instantiation, which I'm trying you out as the John McWhorter to my Glenn Lowry, my every so often conversation partner. So a kind of regular, occasional co-host where we just talk to each other. At a few places, I wanted to start. One thing I wanted to ask, because I realized I hadn't said anything about this. You had a post that was maybe a little bit oblique about this, but I think your father died recently. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, the main thing I learned from that is I had not done my research on the last days of life, which are gnarly. Some gross shit happens.
First of all, I'm sorry. We have talked a little bit about your upbringing before. My memory is that your dad was pretty loving, didn't necessarily deal with you leaving the church or coming out in a rock star way, but that your experiences of having a pretty loving family life up to that point.
Yeah, I mean, it was weird being, for instance, at the funeral where I just have to accept that everyone else's narrative is that this is like a great guy who was, like a good father and, good community member. From my perspective, like in one particular crucial thing, like he failed me in a really wounding way, but there is food on the table every day. The house there's no toxic mold. There's no leaking. The car runs. These are not nothing, right? I mean, let's say that's 90% of the way there. So having to like hold both of those truths.
What was your dad's name?
His legal name was Billy. This is some real Mississippi time.
Okay.
And I'm always tempted at the wedding, at the funeral, to like speak my piece. It's like, excuse me. Some things people forgot to say, but have never done. Like I have to get that out in my writing. That's where that has to go.
What was your relationship with him in the last decade?
I mean, I would say like a very, very typical relationship between like boomer father and child, where I have never heard my father use emotion words. I don't know if like in your experience of couples therapy, you've used the emotion wheel, which is like, all the emotions are on a wheel and you point to where you are on the, I maybe for you and your wife, this is not a problem. It's like articulating how you're feeling. Maybe it's more constraining.
It's not a problem in terms of like knowledge of the emotions. It has been a problem for me historically, and I would say up to the present, always knowing exactly what emotion I'm feeling. Like
so you could use the emotion wheel.
My wife can go from like experiencing emotion to knowledge of what that emotion is incredibly quickly. I mean, she's probably at the far end of the spectrum on that capacity, and I'm not at the worst end of it, but I am. There is some sort of murky black or dark gray space between whatever is happening in the brain and the psyche where the emotion is, and then what I'm able to sort of conceptualize in my mind. So,
okay. I mean, even having the awareness that you do in principle have emotions and a kind of like ethical that you should talk about them.
That gets me to like 50 or 60th percentile, right?
Yeah, that's pretty. I mean, and that's also, I was just thinking in historical terms, you have to be born after a certain year as a man to have had those thoughts.
Well, there have been periods. I think I was reading our shared, intellectual crush, Eva Illouz, in Why Love Hurts. I think she was talking about kind of different periods where there was a much greater emphasis on kind of male emotionality. Maybe that was meaning something different. But
no, I think right there was a closure because Victorian guys are
were very comfortable, right, at professing their love, professing passionate emotions. So you weren't talking about born after,
Well, I think of like my father born in the 50s. Like that was maybe like the golden era of like being a man and being like a white guy, like ethnic whites are having feelings, black people are having feelings, but like proper white people
don't have feelings.
Yeah, you don't have feelings, you don't eat vegetables, you don't go to the doctor.
Did you speak at your dad's funeral or memorial service?
No, the great thing about there being 6 kids is there's always someone who has done a huge PowerPoint show, who has a lot to say. I think half of us spoke, half of us didn't.
And you didn't want to? That was not a...
No, because what the sphere in which I think it's important for me to be like speaking my truth and, you know, confronting people with harsh realities is pretty much only in like people are paying me. That's the domain where I think that's important. But in like, you know, family life, like the private sphere, that's where we shouldn't have free speech.
Do you feel like I'm thinking about my dad? Because my dad and I have been sort of kind of working on some of this stuff. And I have been thinking at this phase of my life, and I'm older than you, but you know, I've had the good fortune that my dad is still alive and still relatively
Yeah,
healthy.
how old is your dad?
My dad is 80. And I have been thinking, and I've gone through the whole sort of cycle, I think, the very sort of modern cycle of like going into therapy in my late 20s and then getting in touch with all of the ways in which I was angry at my parents and all of the ways they had failed me and all of my disappointments about what they didn't do for me. And then I think I'm in a phase now. I don't think we ever process all of that stuff, right? So I don't want to claim more evolution than there is, but consciously the phase I'm in now is what can I appreciate about what they offered to me? I mean, two things. I'm trying to sort of connect with my dad in a way that we haven't before, and that's a complicated thing with limitations. But also just in thinking about myself and my story of him and what he's meant to me, and my mom too, but it's been more kind of front of mind with my dad, like what is it I can appreciate, you know, which is, and we shouldn't, you know, underestimate this, what you said, like food on the table, you know, shelter overhead, relatively stable, you know, my parents are not divorced. So there was kind of some stability around that. So that as a baseline, but then what else? What else can I appreciate? I mean, it's complicated. I don't know if I guess partially I was going to like, are you there yet? I mean, you're on an accelerated timeline, right?
Oh, I
So
mean, it's weird. So like, I mean, maybe your timeline is like more typical of like a straight guy. I don't know. I mean, this is also my partner. I think like hadn't recognized for a while that he was like mad at his parents,
oh, really?
who were like perfect, who were like great. I mean, I also am encountering them now at their most chill. Like, I don't know if this is like your experience, like with your in-laws or your wife's experience of your parents, where like, oh, you're telling me your parents were such hard asses, but like they're
Right.
total sweethearts. They're buying me dinner. They seem very relaxed. They're just happy that you're happy. What the fuck are you talking about? But of course, they were like hitting him with the math flashcards. You know, they were making him go to piano lessons and all of this shit that's actually good parenting. But of course, as a child, you have like anger toward your parents who were like human and failed you. And even the things that they weren't failing you in, where they were like actually doing good, you experienced as kind of shitty because you didn't want to do them. I guess like, right, I could experience very early the like, I hate you, you have
Well,
ruined my
right.
life.
You're saying that's true. So you're saying that the kind of accelerated for gay men in the sense, or at least for you, in the sense that you just there had to be this kind of separation from the family of origin earlier than there was for me. I wish mine had been earlier. I think I would be just a more evolved person if it had been. But yeah, I was like, I felt late, like late 20s, early 30s before I was really kind of dealing with that and thinking through kind of the degrees to which I was kind of enmeshed in my family and not seeing them clearly.
At what age did you have kids?
31.
That makes sense for that to kind of go together. You're thinking like, oh, you know, what do I want to like not fuck up as a dad? Which like clues you into things that like your dad fucked you up about. But also like, oh, actually, like it really is not nothing changing the diapers and going to work. That's actually a lot.
I mean, the thing that provoked it for me was I started dating my wife and I'd never had a serious girlfriend before that. So I think often for a lot of people when they finally have a serious girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever and they move in with them, whatever it is like, oh, I can't organize my life around these relationships from my childhood, my family of origin, right? I need to start privileging this person, who, you know, my romantic partner, and then that just creates conflicts, right? And that was what provoked it for me. I've only recently in the last 4 or 5 years had that recognition of how difficult children can be interpersonally, where I'm incredibly frustrated and angry with my kids and seeing the ways in which they are testing me in ways that just don't seem like they're my fault, right? They just seem like developmental. That is not the reason that my kid, and I won't get too specific, but the reason that my kid is being a total shit to me is not my fault. It's just like the fucking world. And then I'm like, oh, holy shit, it is really hard to deal with. Like, I do not know how to deal with this well.
Yeah.
I'm being an asshole to them because I'm so hurt by them. And I will feel some guilt about that, but some of that is just like, fuck, that's hard.
I've been thinking a lot in the past year or so about like there are these guys like Paul Duguay or Ian Hunter in Australia who are like neo-Weberians who are really into Weberian concepts of persona, you know, that we occupy these different, not quite overlapping personae in our lives, and that we ought not to have a kind of wish to unify them as an organic whole. Like that's a
Mm.
constant temptation. Like if only they all aligned, or they could be put in a hierarchy, but that we have these different roles, and that a lot of features of contemporary life invite us to see that as inauthentic and to focus on like a core personal self with values that move across the different roles. But this is a much lighter version. But like when I started teaching, so this was like 2018, 2022, when I was at UChicago, having to remain in an awareness of they are not relating to me as a person, really, like they don't know anything about me, but they have a lot that they're going to project onto like the teacher.
I was going to say you dodged my question. I'm not that's imputing kind of motive, unconscious motive. Where are you on your dad? Are you thinking about what you took from him that was positive, or are you kind of at the kind of bare subsistence level, like he provided a home and put food on the table?
Yeah, in terms of like his values, I mean, in many ways is like seemingly another universe. I mean, he was like classic bundle of old school Republican contradictions, like libertarian who worked for the city government, working with and under Black people who he hated. He was very much like the king of his little suburban house, which is like covered in security cameras, full of guns, full of survivalist shit. So like months worth of dried food in case, like if the banks collapse, there's silver. I thought all that was crazy growing up. I hated that. But I do find myself very drawn to the lure of independence. I was asked, for instance, I have something coming out in a few weeks on this Substack about the new romanticism, the new literary romanticism, it's like Matthew Gaston and some people. And I agreed to do this because I was like, well, this is an opportunity to plug my own work and also to promote. I read about Andrew Holleran, who's a gay author that I like. But as soon as I started engaging with these concepts, like, well, is there such a thing as the new romanticism? What is that? Where does this idea come from? What are y'all selling? I don't want to be part of this team.
You want to be part of no team, I've noticed.
I don't want to put forward as a principle that there are no good teams. But I think, yeah, maybe this is like, the gun-toting libertarian freeholder that just wants to like have a lot of empty land around. I want that maybe in my mind. Like I want to live in the city. But yeah, when I hear the like centrist liberals, or I hear the new romantics coming, I'm like, okay.
Of your two parents, which of them would you locate the kind of, granting that you're quite a smart person, of your mom or dad, which of the two of them seems more the source of that?
Oh, I mean, my mom is a psychologist with a PhD in psychology, does like clinical. So I'm very like the way that I am smart is very similar to the way that she is. My father was like an engineer and very into being able to fix anything. This like masculine competence, which is like I can assemble the gun, I can assemble the car, I can build the house. Shit, I do not want to do. And I mean, this is like note for dads. Looking back, like the last thing that I had to learn with my father, he did my mom's billing for her therapy practice. And a year or so ago, when he was in like a relatively healthy phase, like more or less normal, like the radiation was working then, he's like supposed to teach me the billing process, like how to use like Therapist Helper, how to blah, blah, blah. And as he's getting frustrated with the software, which like just isn't working, and like I can't get the login and it's being stupid, I have like thousands of Vietnam flashbacks, right, where Charlie is coming out of the bushes. I'm remembering doing math homework with him. I'm remembering like helping him on some construction project, like helping him change the oil, and he's getting frustrated and I'm getting yelled at. And I don't think it was like about me, because I think this happens to him like doing anything. Him even having a good day, doing something, there's this like frustration and cussing. And as a sensitive little boy, like I hated that. And all the domains of like male competence that he wanted to invite me into, his manner of doing that was like so rebarbative and unpleasant that like, yeah, I was like, oh, I'm going to gravitate toward activities where I'm not going to get yelled at. It certainly made me think like if my partner and I like ever have kids, or just in general, like inviting people into shit that I think is awesome ought to not have the emotional tone of I hate this and I hate you.
Right. And I will shame you for not sharing my sort of fascination with this thing. Where are you on the emotion wheel? How are you feeling?
Yeah. I mean, this is the great thing about children of therapists. I certainly have a verbal and intellectual familiarity with emotions, and I love naming other people's emotions. Like, don't you notice that you're feeling this way toward me? Do I like my own emotions and sitting with vulnerability? No, no. And also, like, intellectually, I don't know that we're supposed to do that. I did do couples therapy with my partner last year, in part just because of like class differences, which like I hadn't thought about so much affecting our relationship, but like they affect how you think about money and
Well,
how
I
you
mean,
think
at a
about work.
minimum, we're supposed to try and know what our emotions are so we're not diverting them into other less constructive forms, right? I mean, I guess you could get into questions about how much or how long we're supposed to dwell in them, but I would think the kind of basic therapeutic assumption is like if you're not in some sense in touch with and maybe aware of what you're feeling, then it's going to come out in destructive ways.
That's how they charge you. That's the premise that
Right.
pays them.
Which I have accepted in a profoundly wholehearted way, but I'm open to your
That premise put me through private school.
as we evade my question about where you are on the emotion wheel. I'm open to your to your challenge to that whole paradigm.
So, I mean, a fantasy book, maybe Eva Illouz probably doesn't have, I mean, she lived forever, but she probably doesn't have time to write this. I would love to read a book that's like defense mechanisms. Yay. Because somehow in like the popular uptake of this like early 20th century psychoanalytic language, it's like you're supposed to be breaking down your defense mechanisms. You're supposed to be limitlessly vulnerable and reinterpreting and exploring. And a lot of like the world is a bad place. Like reality is dangerous.
Right, right. We need defenses.
And, you know, at one point in couples therapy, as like the sort of phase one was like thinking about family of origin stuff. The therapist wants to convince us to share his assumption that like family dynamics of family of origin of like our parents are somehow at play like in our relationship. And if you deny it, whether you deny that like coolly or with emotion, you look like a crazy person who is just reinforcing the therapist point.
Right.
And so like I don't see my partner as being, I don't feel like I do with my parents in relation to my partner.
Yeah, I was going to say that is almost like this. What is the? I feel like there's a phrase in biology, the central dogma. Isn't there like something like that, like the central dogma of kind of the therapeutic paradigm or the couples therapy paradigm? I don't think it's that we 100% what's happening in our relationship to our partner is a reenactment of some form in some version of our sort of relationship to one or both of our parents, but that it's a lot of it. You can't fully understand your relationship problems, and maybe you can't even get right in them without understanding the ways in which you're reenacting or inverting or something like that, those patterns.
I challenge, I question.
Well, so wait, there's two things. I mean, you're questioning that, but you're also, I think you were questioning the basic, which is more the kind of central dogma of like therapy or something like that, individual therapy, or the whole kind of psychological paradigm that we are healthiest when we engage in some sense with our emotions, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I certainly think like there is often something to be gained. I mean, I think this is in the classic Freudian paradigm, like, the neurosis is the defense mechanism that's no longer serving you. You're doing some weird obsession, you're off in some self-destructive fantasy, but the basic thought that you should not be aware of all of your feelings, desires, whatever, and like, in order to be at all healthy, to survive in the world, you need to not be aware of things. You need to repress them. You need to control them. And that the world is not a totally safe place to be vulnerable and to be taking yourself apart in.
I struggle with this point, Blake, because I mean, I hear you and I partially agree with you. I struggle with this point because a defender of therapy or something like that could respond to you like that's a vulgarized perception of what we're saying, right? So like my boy Terry Real, for instance, he has this phrase in his system, the adaptive child, and it's not his idea. That's just his gloss on it. And one of the points he makes is, the adaptive child is like the mechanisms, the defense mechanisms, the strategies we evolved as children to deal with emotions or things that would overwhelm us, where we would just our psyche would totally dissolve. And he's like, it's maladaptive often as adults, but it absolutely was adaptive as kids, right? Like there is more to absorb as a kid than our immature psyches are capable of absorbing. And as such, even in the healthiest of environments, we are going to create mechanisms to fend off just the overwhelmingness of the world. So, right, you can come up with all these nuanced versions of that. And I think, but what I struggle with is like, as a whole, the therapeutic paradigm absolutely is saying some version of what you're saying. It is saying the vulgarized thing, right? And so what I struggle with is, as I'm writing a book on these things, as I'm writing about these things in which I'm trying to offer my nuanced version of it, but I fear that I am reinforcing this kind of vulgarized version of it that has consequences, right? That has negative consequences of it. Because, right, once it's translated to Tumblr or Twitter or Blue Sky or Substack or something, all of these spaces, or TikTok, it's doing certain kinds of damage, right? And you can't just say, that's not my Marxism, right? Like, Stalin is not my Marxism. My Marxism is an incredibly nuanced thing, right? I mean, you can't divorce yourself from that. At the same time that I don't want to grant that, like, all of, the smartest therapists and psychologists are just saying this simplistic version of it.
So this is something that I think Eva Illouz is really good about. So she, on the one hand, in her thinking about contemporary relationships, absolutely recognizes the value, and I mean, in some cases, even like the necessity of, if not the actual practice of couples therapy for everyone, she sees something really adaptive and positive in the uptake of therapeutic language by like white collar, upper middle class professionals, which I think almost everyone else who talks about this, especially from like a left perspective, but also cultural right, like sees that as, neoliberal, and
Right.
it's this like terrible technology that lets individuals adapt in a socially dysfunctional.
Right. It's like a privatization of like what should be collective challenges or something like that. And it's also diverting energy. If there's some sort of, hydraulic mechanism of energy, right? It's diverting energy away from what would have gone towards political action into personal self-development and things like that, right?
But truly, couples therapy was helpful for me, and I don't have the resources to reshape society, right? So like,
well, that's where I end up too, right? So when I said earlier, like, I 100% kind of buy into this paradigm, that's not really true. Like, I think I agree with you. Like, what's fascinating about Illouz and great about her is she brings us back into the psychological or emotional or something ecosystem of previous eras and allows you to see that, like, this is not the only way to be, right? And it is not at all clear that this way to be is preferable in some cosmic sense to the Victorian way to be. But the fact of the matter is, this is the system in which we live, not just in which we live, but within which we were conditioned, right? Like, so
yeah.
At the moment, there may be no other option. We can critique it, but if we want to flourish to the extent possible within the existing system, that's where I think I end up. Like, this is the best thing we have going in the limited years I have on the planet. This is the way to go.
And I think Illouz is right. She's linked up to all the kind of critical sociology suggesting that there's something bad and, narrowing for the human experience that we have the same person as our primary romantic, emotional, financial, logistical partner. Like, that's a huge, crazy, impossible demand to put on one person. We spend increasingly little time with other people. We have ever smaller families and networks of friends. Most people, don't have a rich, like, associational life. And so, like, of course, you need help. You need to bring in like third parties, and you need to bring in some kind of, like, we don't have access to folklore. Like, I can't ask the wise old woman, what should I do with my partner when I'm mad at him? So that we need a new kind of secular priest. We need these kinds of technologies for mediating our relationships, which are like so important in ways that are maybe not ideal. But
I asked ChatGPT to help me with my marriage this week. And it's, I just, sorry, I mean, you're talking about technologies. I mean, yes, the therapist, obviously, but like, I literally typed into ChatGPT. I won't share much about, whatever the conflict we were in, but I was in a conflict with my wife. And I was in that space that maybe not everybody is familiar with, but probably most of us, where it was kind of after it had been hot, it had cooled down some, but it was not yet warm. There had not the kind of repair, the reconnection had not happened. And I didn't know what to say. I had the thought, I had enough presence of mind to be like, I should try and say something constructive right now. My brain is not functioning well enough for me to know what that thing is. Type into ChatGPT, hey, ChatGPT, do you know Terry Real's, relational life therapy system?
Oh, you can get it real specific.
I got real specific. And they're like, yes. And then it could list, here are the 5 premises of, Terry Real, well-known psychologist. I was like, based on that, here is the situation. I described the scenario, the conflict we were having. What do you recommend I say right now? And it gave me really fucking good advice on like, what do I say right now to my wife, whether, in person or text or something like that, to be constructive. And I was precisely in that space of like, this is fucking ridiculous, right? I'm asking a large language model to advise me on what to say to my wife in the midst of a conflict. but I am not going to not avail myself of this technology if it can help me in my marriage. Like, the stakes are too high.
Well, so right. I mean, something thinking about like personae is helpful for me with is like, it's not as though being a good partner is just or primarily about being my authentic self.
Right.
So like, right, the therapist, the friend, ChatGPT, somehow in like the collective, the they and its wisdom, there might be some very applicable things about like being a good partner, being a good son, father, whatever, that like I don't need to figure out what is like the thing that is truest to who I really am to say in this moment.
Right.
Usually.
But also, by the same token, to go back to my question about where you are on the emotion wheel, do you kind of operate from the same perspective, which is we can apply our sort of critical intellects to the question of whether that central dogma that we should be in touch, if we're not in touch with our emotions, it will sort of come out in sort of, other more destructive ways. And yet at the same time say that given this is the sort of psychological economy in which we were raised, is that still the best strategy? And you're sort of conceding it in the sort of relational space, but I'm not sure if you're conceding it in the kind of individual space.
Right. There are definitely times when like, we're having maladaptive defense mechanisms where I'm acting unknowingly in ways that are self-destructive and I need to be clued into it. But I mean, I brought up Luz earlier to say like doubly, she's right about couples therapy, but she also has the really great insight that the implicit ideal of contemporary therapy is this unlimitedly open, vulnerable, self-aware person, which is impossible. And because it's impossible, it's a really good ideal for therapists because there's always new things you could be learning about yourself. You could always be making a breakthrough, and you could always be recoding what you had hitherto taken to be successful features of your personality, like adaptive things that you like about yourself that are working well. Say, oh, actually, that's maladaptive. That's like a failing defense mechanism. I need to unpack that. I need to go back to my earlier trauma, sit with that, rethink who I am. I'm very Scarlett O'Hara in that sense. There's all these scenes in Gone with the Wind that
I haven't seen, so you're going to have to be more.
Oh my God. How are you? Texas is.
How am I living in the South and haven't seen? Yeah.
Take 3 hours. Take the wife and kids. Watch Gone with the Wind. Most notably, the end of the movie. Rhett, her love interest, has left her. Where shall I go? What shall I do? He says, I don't give a damn, and closes the door, walks out, and she's like, well, I'll think about that tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of life, right? Like
I think a good therapist would not be sort of prescriptive, for instance, about when is the right time to deal with certain things. Like, I'm imagining myself as your therapist. If we were in therapy right now, Blake, and I said, like, where are you on the emotion wheel? And then we ended up in this long kind of digression about Eva Luz and different sort of emotional paradigms throughout history. I'd be
can't catch me with that shit.
Right. I mean, I'd be like, well, obviously you're deflecting, right? Like, obviously you don't want to be in that space right now. And one of your big defense mechanisms, obviously, is kind of cerebrating things, right? And intellectualizing them. And I'd be like, yeah, but how are you feeling, Blake? And again, I think a good therapist, knowing you, knowing the sort of broad spectrum of the ways in which you deal with things, the answer to that could be like, well, Blake will get to it when it's time to get to it, right? It's okay. Sure, it's a defense mechanism, but defense mechanisms allow us to sort of function. But you wouldn't deny that they would be thinking to themselves, obviously Blake is like, it's too much for him right now. He's deflecting.
Oh, sure. But, by the same token, if Freud is right, Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, go into his office and, all these drawings of the burly women with weird vaginas that don't look like how vaginas should. Seems like you've got some issues to work through. Let's talk about that. Let's stop making the beautiful art. What's the gain there? Does society win?
Well, right. And this is where I run up against the limit of my sort of knowledge of psychoanalysis, right? There is this sort of mechanism of sublimation, which I think for Freud, sublimation was a relatively healthy means of processing issues into art. Is that that's what you're talking about, right? Wasn't that, and we talked about that in what, I forget which, the text where he's talking about Da Vinci's, dreams and, all of that, right? Doesn't he do a long deconstruction of?
Yeah. I mean, it's a totally crazy reading of Da Vinci's childhood dreams. And
yeah, right. So yes. Okay. But you're deflecting the question again, right? Will you grant me that a therapist, even a good one, would say to themselves, well, Blake has some grieving left to do. And maybe now is not precisely the time.
Oh, sure.
But there will be a time, and if he didn't, that ultimately that probably would be self-destructive in some way. And you have to do it with me on a podcast. I mean, who the fuck am I, right?
No, but I'm often unclear, like, what do therapists think the final state is? What am I working toward when I have accessed the full depths of all of my feeling? How will life be better? What will I gain? When I run into some like specific block, like I'm yelling at you because I'm really mad at my dad. Like, okay, I should be, I need to work through some shit with.
I'm thinking about what Jonathan Lear would say about this, because his last book, which I wrote about and which I talked to him about, was about a lot about mourning. Jonathan Lear, who just died not that long ago, the psychoanalyst and philosopher. I'm sure he would agree with you. There is no final state, right? I mean, one of the things I remember him talking a lot about in that book of mourning and what it was a kind of ongoing process of kind of creative reenactment of whatever, of an experience, of a feeling, of a dynamic. So, I mean, I think for him, some version of health would just be, well, you spend the rest of your life and you think about your relationship to your dad, and you think about, and your mom and whatever else, and you in different aspects of it. And each time you do it, nobody does it optimally. You're adding something new. There's a creative element to it, right? So the dysfunctional element is just an endless reenactment of the same thing, right? Which I'm sure you would agree with me, that is a thing that people do, that unhealthy people do. They just go over and over and over in the same way, telling the same story to themselves and acting the same dynamic but a healthy version of repetition is just, you are going through the sum of the same things over and over again through your life. But each time you're doing, or at least some of the times you're doing it, there's an element of, creativity and reinterpretation, and it's evolving over time. And that's health, no final state, but just that process of endlessly creative re-engagement of some of the same things.
I mean, I don't know what's healthy or unhealthy, but I mean, certainly we could recode that as like boring versus fun, right? I mean, because we all know people who have like the same story about their ex that they're always telling, or the same story about their childhood. And I think like, even if you've attained an accurate perspective, this is dreadful. Like, I'm tired of hearing about this. It must be really boring to live it. Would it be healthy to be continually reimagined? I mean, you could reimagine it in crazy and retarded ways, but that sounds more fun. That sounds exciting. Like, what's going to happen? How will I be grieving next year?
Well, in the post where you mentioned that your dad had died, you talked about maybe there's a way in which a lot of the stuff I've been writing over the past few years has been about fathers and sons. And so, sure, that could be it, right? I mean, it's just like, and I think that's what Lear's talking about, right? I mean, I think it won't be boring, right? It won't be boring. I mean, you and I do this kind of weird thing of sort of publicly processing this stuff or writing for the public about these things. But I mean, there's a personal or an interpersonal version of this, right? Like, it shouldn't be boring if we're doing it in a sort of healthy way.
Yeah, but just, of course, some like Jewish psychoanalyst in academia thinks that like endlessly being curious and reinterpreting, that's health. Like, of course, yes. But, it could be health as having figured everything out and just doing that.
Neither of us believe that, right? I mean,
neither of us believe it, right? But I think, we're both, that's a very specific acculturation into like an actually very narrow kind of open-mindedness.
Sure. Okay. The form it takes doesn't have to be the ideal form of like the academically oriented Dan Oppenheimer or Blake Smith or Jonathan Lear or Eva Luz or something like that. But that even the sort of ancient form of it, right? Even the ancient Greeks or the Victorian English or the medieval Chinese or something like that. Wouldn't the form of it have had it would have looked very different, but wouldn't there have been some degree of creativity to it? I find it hard to believe that there would have been, a civilization in which the people that were looked on as the kind of highest form of that life would have been people where it was a kind of static repetition of a certain set of practices.
This is an odd, but so Barocius, this Greek-speaking Babylonian of the Hellenistic era, writes this history of ancient Mesopotamia, which we have only through other Greek texts. Like, we don't have the actual text, we have citations of it. But Barocius talks about how there's these like 7 fish monsters that come out of the sea and teach human beings all the arts of civilization. And after the last fish monster leaves, we have writing and architecture and religion and blah, blah, blah. And since that day, no one has invented anything. And that's, it's a 3,000 year civilization, from Ur to, Acadia to the Syrian, And of course, things were changing, but how you ought to understand the world and yourself is by emphasizing your fidelity to ancient patterns. Whereas we choose to emphasize in our self-interpretation and collective self-interpretation, novelty, historicity, change, adaptability to change, creativity. But that's a choice.
But even within that, I guess I'm imagining within like that sort of within a civilization in which the highest form of life was fidelity to these patterns that were given to us by the seven fish monsters, a few thousand years ago. I guess I'm still thinking that the sort of picture of a kind of ideal life would probably be one in which there were different developmental phases. What we would call different developmental phases, right? I remember listening to some podcast once, and I have no idea if this is true or not, but it's kind of a useful example where some philosopher or sort of academic from India was talking about how kind of in the Indian paradigm, whatever he meant by that, there were different ways of being that were appropriate at different phases of life, right? So it's like, when you're in your 20s, there's this period of kind of striving and acquisition. And then when you're in your, 30s and 40s, your orientation shifts towards sort of cultivation of and responsibility for the family. In your 50s and 60s, you're more towards like a role of kind of mentor to other younger people who are in your either in your profession or in your community or something like that. And then the last phase is one of like contemplation of the universe or the well-being of civilization or of your civilization or your society or something. It was something like that. But I'm saying that kind of thing, I think, would align with my notion that there's a sort of, that is still a civilization in which the ideal form of life is not one that's static, right? So maybe it's fidelity to ancient principles, but the way in which a person, enacts that fidelity shifts throughout their life.
Yeah, so I mean, it would be like, I don't know if people have thought about this in terms of like intercultural philosophy or comparative, but right. So thinking of ancient India or like Buddhist traditions, or even Cicero in his book on duties, like De Officiis, is thinking about you might have a certain attraction to philosophy, but you also have your duty toward the political realm. You have your duty as a householder to your family. Life is composed of these distinct ethical spheres. And then there's a kind of meta capacity, which he calls like humanitas or honestas, which is like how you relate to them properly. And it's, for him, it's not right to get totally seduced into one of them. Like there's something, it's a not ideal life to be totally devoted to contemplation or be totally devoted to fighting in war. But that ability to move rightly through the stages of life with their distinct tasks, or the ability to move rightly among your different roles as like husband, father, contemplator, there is like a highest level ethical skill, which, we tend to think of, I guess, as moderns as like reflexivity, as criticality, also as like creativity, adaptability. But
I don't know what the right word for it is, right? Because I think we probably ultimately agree in some sense, which is I want to be very conscious of the fact that my particular mode of that therapeutic, intellectual, critical is not the only way to live a good life. I think what I'm just insisting on is that stasis is probably never a good way to live. I was thinking of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather's memorial service. People had very complicated feelings towards my grandpa, who was a difficult man, but also a man who worked hard, put food on the table, as far as we know, was faithful to my grandmother.
That's a fun addition. That's
right. Lived a relatively ethical life according to kind of social norms and things like that. And I remember there were a number of eulogies at the service that consciously or unconsciously were sort of pointing towards the ways in which he was difficult, right? And emotionally inaccessible and stubborn and not always, I don't know if anybody pointed, my grandfather was a champion fucking liar. Like clearly thought like in any situation, if in that moment it was slightly emotionally easier to tell a lie than to tell the truth, he would just opt for the lie. And sometimes it seemed like maybe he just opted for the lie for the hell of it when there was no obvious.
You got to stay in practice.
You got to stay in practice. I think my mom says there's like 4 different stories he told about what he did with my grandmother's ashes. And like, why would you make up different stories about that, right?
Mourning is iterative.
I'm not sure if that's what it was for my grandma.
R.I.P. Jonathan Lear, you would have loved Daniel Oppenheimer's maternal grandfather.
Right. But I remember my older brother, in my memory, this is what came out in his eulogy, but I actually I'm not even sure, I couldn't attest the fact that he did speak, but this is something I know my older brother felt was there was insufficient respect paid to the ways in which my grandfather, lived up to his socially assigned responsibilities. He felt very strongly, in a world where so many people don't do that, we need to credit and to reduce his life just to the ways in which he was like not an ideal late 20th century emotional man who was transparent and vulnerable is to really do an injustice to him. And I think in my brother's perspective, to just have an inadequate moral, ethical paradigm for how we should evaluate people. So like, I accept that. But I think we probably are in agreement that, like you said, this is at your dad's service, this was what people were crediting, right?
Yeah. His like successful maintenance of these roles. And then, people for sure recognized, alluded to the way that he could be like, guarded and closed off and not very expressive, except the way of letting you know that he loves you is like he's following the weather where you are, right? Mm-hmm. He's asking about like how you got down here. What was the traffic? And it's also entirely possible that, like, would he have been able to fulfill his obligations, and would he have survived? Would he have benefited from being more emotionally open? I don't know. Maybe he wouldn't have made it. Because, like, the world my father grew up in, like, his mom was kind of illiterate. He, like, grew up on a farm with, like, really nothing and, became, like, a white-collar professional. I think he probably had a bigger jump from that to his life than I did from his life to mine. For me, like, I might have wished him greater emotional expressivity, but I can't say that I know he would have benefited from that.
Let me ask you a different kind of question, because I was just rereading your recent essay on Harold Rosenberg, the art critic and maybe sort of philosopher in a sense. Where did that publish?
Aeon,
one of the good online magazines. And I was struggling a little bit with your explanation of Rosenberg's notion of action and sort of what artists should do, like what action represents. You historically, politically situated that I think Rosenberg was a Marxist probably in the 30s, maybe in the 20s and 30s. And then, like many people of his generation, his intellectual generation, became disillusioned with Marxism, with the Soviet Union, with various figures within that. And then a lot of like the kind of post-war intellectual history of the New York intellectuals and other groups was in the aftermath of that kind of disillusionment. How do we think about political action? But for Rosenberg, how do we think about kind of artistic action or artistic work, and what should be driving it and what should its virtues be? Can you tell me what his notion of action was? I think it's clearly applicable beyond the artistic realm.
Yeah, I mean, one, it's tricky. And I got into him in the first place because he was very close friends with Hannah Arendt from the 50s to their deaths in the mid to late 70s. And they were both the advisors at the University of Chicago of Michael Denneny, who I'm working on a book on with U Chicago Press. Arendt and Rosenberg both in the 50s get really into this notion of action. And for both of them, it's real vague and shifting. It was a bit like, if you remember in 2006, 2007, when conservatives wanted to win the Iraq war by invading Iran, it's like, if we make the problem bigger, we get better leverage on it somehow, right? So like, I don't understand quite what Arendt is up to, but what if I also added this other problem? And what Rosenberg wants, what he wants to get a hold on is, he's coming out of, this Marxist milieu and an engagement with French existentialism, both of which in different ways are interested in the problem.
Hey, so this is the free teaser. If you want to hear the whole thing, you know what you have to do. You have to subscribe, at least for this month, and send some moolah my way.